Hello everybody, in this tutorial we're gonna learn how to implement post method in ASP.NET. Using JavaScript, we're gonna send data from the view to the controller. Now let's jump to Visual Studio and create a new project. Now inside the Visual Studio, we're gonna create a new MVC ASP.NET project. Let's call it JSON demo, for example. Now let's create the create button and let's pick the MVC model. Now we have an MVC model project, empty project. So we have the content, the model, the view, and the controllers folders are all empty. Now inside the models folder, we're gonna create a new class. So this model is going to contain the data we're gonna use. So let's call it JSON model. Then create. Now we're gonna work with two properties. The first is going to be an ID of type string, and the second going to be a name of the same type string. Now let's go back to our home controller and let's see what we have here. Here we have an action result, index, and about, and another page called contact. And here we're gonna add our new action result method we're gonna use to store our data. So let's create a new action result and let's call it JSON data, for example, or save JSON data. But before that, we need to go to our scripts folder and let's create a new JSON file. This JSON gonna contain the data we're gonna use to store our data using our model and our controller. So let's call it data JSON. And here we're gonna type our ID, we're gonna give our ID a value and our name a value. Then we're gonna try to input new values, then store it here. Now let's jump to our controller and let's create a new folder and let's call it data. And inside this data, we're gonna store our data JSON. Okay, next we're gonna try to create the JSON data action result that gonna contain the data JSON we just created. So we're gonna start with the JSON file path, and this is going to be a new method. We're gonna use it to extract the file path we already create. Now we're gonna get the file content. The file content, getting the file content is going to be using an if statement, and we're gonna check every time if the file exists in the JSON file path we already created. So now we're gonna get the file content if system.eo.file.exists, and it's going to take parameter as the JSON file path we already create. Now inside of it, we're going to create a new variable, and we're going to call it json. This json is going to take to read all the text inside the JSON file path we already create. So let's type var json equal system.eo.file.read all text, and inside the parameter we're gonna put the JSON file path we already create. Okay, now everything is ready. Let's check if our JSON path JSON file is not empty or it's not null. So if not a string is null or empty, and it's going to take as parameter our JSON file, just the JSON we already create. So one important thing before we proceed working with this is you should know that all the data should be in one line. So if we want to make the serialization, we need to make sure that all the data should be in one line. So I'm going to make a comment here, so after this tutorial completed you can check it again and you already know what this means. Now we're gonna create a new variable and we're gonna call it intended JSON. So what we're gonna do here is we are going to take off all the spaces in the environment. So JSON identity JSON equal to JSON.trim, and this trim method is going to access to the replace, and it's going to replace all the empty spaces in our line. And after we do this, we're gonna access our view bag, the JSON data inside of our view bag is going to be equal assigned to the intended JSON. So those steps are very important every time you wanna read or you wanna post content inside the JSON file using the post method, or you're gonna extract data from the JSON in your scripts folder or any other place. So now we're gonna return the view, and the view is going to be the JSON data. Okay, next all we need to do is to create our getJSON path method. This method is going to give us the path of the JSON we already created inside the data folder. Now let's create our new method, the getJSON path, and this method is going to return a string that contains the JSON path file. So private string getJSON path, and inside of it all we need to do is to create a new variable, and we're gonna call it root folder, and in this folder we're gonna access the file URL using the server. So server.mappath. Okay, next we're gonna return the path of the folder if the folder is already existed inside of the URL we're gonna type using the combine method. Now let's create a new folder and let's call it app. So this folder is going to contain a new JavaScript uh, that will contain all the work we're gonna do to extract data from to pass data from the view to the controller. So if we start typing, all we need to do is to access the document. Before we start working with and manipulate the data, we need to make sure that all the document is ready. So the document is ready is going to give us the possibility to work with all the data flow inside the document if they are already on the client side. So we need to read the JSON file. Before we started, we're gonna create a new data variable, and this data variable is going to contain the parts of the JSON model. Next, we're gonna work with an if statement that if the data is not finished or the data dot length is more than 0, we're gonna first let's try to make the data dot length is more than 0. Then we need to access using a for loop all the variable and all the data inside of it. So this loop is going to start with the 0 to the data dot length. Okay, before we proceed, let's try to make console.log is going to show a message inside the console of our client. So ID is going to be the data that of I element that we are already working with .id. So we're gonna access the I element, the ID of the I element of the data. Next, we're gonna access the content. The content is the name. Don't forget that we are working with only two properties, the ID and the name. Content is going to be equal to the data of the I element dot name. there is an extra parenthesis on our document after the function directly, so we need to delete it in order to proceed. So we're okay, and now all we need to do is to get the data from the HTML. So we need to create a new function, and this function is gonna be the save JSON data. This is the most important part of this tutorial. So we need to get the data from the HTML. And before we proceed, all we need to do is to create two variables. The first variable is going to contain the data for the first element of our model, and the second is going to contain the data for our second element. So the first is going to be with the ID 7113, and with a name. You can pick a name for yourself. For example, I will proceed with 71113, and it's the same for the second element, so you can copy and paste it as you want. So this is going to be the second. Then all we need to do is to create an array that we're gonna build an array that going to contain the data. I prefer to name it data to be sent. It's very clear if another developer working with your code. It's very important that developers can understand each other. So the first and the second. So the first and the second element are going to be a part of our data. For example, if you are working with a for loop that making the document of I, a very easy solution to work with is the push. The push function gives us the possibility to push the data of I element in the last element of the array. And now let's send the data via Ajax. So Ajax is going to have 4 or 5 strong typed and hard typed properties. The first is the URL, and the URL is going to contain the URL for our method inside of our home controller. So if you type save JSON data here, you need to type it there as it is typed here. It's the same. And the type is going to be a post or method, post method or get method, or some people want just to replace with the put method, and the data type will be of course the type JSON. And then we have the data. What data means, what data you are going to send using the JSON and using the post method. In our case, we are going to send the data to be sent. That's why the name is very important if you want other developers to understand your code. So data, and we need 2 points, and then data to be sent. And later we need to add another last property, is the success. If it is successful, we're gonna create a new function that takes 2 parameters. The first is the result and the second is the status. Okay, and later we're gonna create another alert that takes as a property our result. Alert result. And now we finished working with our home.js file. Now our JS is ready. Let's go back to the controller and let's create an HTTP method post. So this action result is going to be named save JSON.data. It's the same name we use it in the home.js file. So the data is going to be a list of our JSON model. Make sure to import the JSON model and the namespace models here to prevent errors in your project. Now we're gonna try to make an if statement that the data is not null. If the data is not empty, we need to make a try statement. Try, and of course we're gonna create another one for the exception, and all we need to do is to serialize data. Serialized data means that we are going to extract the data from the file path, and we're gonna write all the text using the JSON file path and the JSON document. So we need to serialize data, and we're gonna create a new variable of type string. This variable is going to take the JSON convert dot serialize object, and this method is going to take two parameters. The first is going to be our data, and the second is going to be the formatting indented. Okay, now let's create a new variable, and let's call it JSON file path or JSON path file. Okay, this variable is going to get the JSON file we already created, the path of our JSON file. So we're going to create another if statement, and inside this if statement we're going to access the JSON file. If the file exists, we need to write the new data inside of it. So we need to access to the library of the system.io.file.exists, and it's going to take as parameter the JSON file path, not the get JSON path, but it's going to take the JSON path file. Okay, now if the file exists, we need to write the new data inside of it. All we need to do is to access the file.writeAllText method that takes two parameters. The first is the path, and the second is going to be the serialized object we already created with the name JSON. So JSON. Next, all we need to do is to return a true content if this instruction are valid and everything is going okay, and we're gonna just type false if it's not. So let's copy and let's paste it after the catch. Don't forget to put the exception inside the catch. Inside the catch, we need to return a value of the content that it's going to be false. After that, after the try and the catch statement, we need inside the if statement, we need to return a value outside the if statement that content result is going to be false. That means if it's null, it's going to return false, or if the data is not what we expected from the home.js file, it's going to return a false value. And all we need to do now, let's just add a new, and inside of our home view, we're gonna create a new racer page. Let's call it for example save JSON file or save JSON data, and let's save it. Now inside the view, let's delete the layout is null, and let's create a new view bag, title, and inside of it all the work we're gonna do is inside of our JSON file, JSON data.cs HTML. So view bag is going to be our JSON data. Okay, now we need to delete all the rest of this code and let's try to import the scripts we are going to work with. First, we are using the Ajax query in our JSON in our home.js. So we need an URL that specifies that we are going to work with the jQuery 3.4.1 min.js. The name for this file is going to be inside of your scripts folder inside your project. Okay, then we're gonna make another link for the script that we already created is the home.js. The second is going to be the home.js we already created. So if you want to take the URL, you need to go to your scripts folder, and inside of it we already create a new app folder and we call it home.js. You need to just take it and paste it. I'm going to paste this to save more time. Now we're gonna create another script. It's going to be another new variable that's going to be called JSON model, and inside of it we're gonna make the HTML.raw and we're gonna access our bag view bag that .json data. Make sure that the JSON data have the same name with the title we already created. Okay, now let's try to add, let's delete all the rest of this code and let's try just to implement two buttons. The first one is going to be for the first variable and the second is going to be for the second variable. Let's create a new text that's called JSON data. Then let's try to create a new text that is going to be first. The first should be going as an input that take an ID. The ID we already created inside of our JSON file is going to be 7113. Then let's create type. The type is going to be text, and next we're gonna choose style for the input. You can choose margin left or margin right or anything you want. For me, I'm going to work with the margin left and working with the 22 pixels. Just delete the semicolon, delete It's here. Okay, now let's try to close the input and let's try to make space, a free space, 2 or 3 lines, then try to input the second element of our home.js we already created. So the second input is going to be the same with another ID. If you want to use the here we are going to use the same ID to have the same result saved from the two elements. So if we type in the first case 6 for example, it's going to store the values in both the ID and the name in the JSON file. So the text, then let's try to make free space, for example 2 or 3 lines, and then all we need to do is to create our method. Our method is going to be placed with a button. The button is going to have a method that it's going to be on click we're going to create a new method that's already created, that is saved JSON data, with the value save JSON data or save JSON file as you want. Okay, here we need to put save JSON data, and the value, we need to pick a value. The value is going to be save JSON data. Now let's test. Okay, we have our JSON data page, the first element and the second element. Let's type first, for example, and second, and let's submit using the save JSON data. So the status is true as we saw, as we put there. So if we access our data JSON file, we need to find the data is stored, but there is a problem because we are already working with the same value. So let's change it here, and if you want, go to the data.json and change the IDs. So here all you need to do is to access your new URL. So the URL is going to be another. So second, let's just try to post again, and let's go back to our JSON file, and you see that the second is typed there. So everything is going great.